Hello everyone, today we talk about Alamannia and Alpine Raetia between the 5th and the 10th century, so a bit of early medieval southwestern German history. We already made a video about the Alamanni, which is very old, and perhaps I will remake it. I've seen that gets a lot of views, so I hope this is interesting. Actually, I would like to tell you that I am starting a new series, this video, about the history of medieval Germany and medieval Italy, bit of Holy Roman Imperial history that we will start seeing a bit more specifically and in detail. Today we talk, as you understand, of a very delicate moment of transition between literally, the Germanic tribes to the most institutionalized forms of the Eastern Frankish kingdom, which Alamannia/Swabia, we will explain this in a while, played definitely an important part, not a dramatic leading role, as we will see fundamentally. Alemannic history is a bit characterized by internal division, of instability, so it's not a strong area, and also in the High Middle Ages, this, especially after the collapse of the Hohenstaufen, this area will never be reunited, would never be an actual center of, a single center of power for the centuries to come. But there is all a specific cultural legacy and identity of this area. This beautiful. I don't know if you ever traveled across Swabia. I did. It's one of my favorite regions in Europe in absolute terms. And there are multiple ties. I hope with this, more territorial look at politics and military history, we will look at these various areas of Europe that deserve definitely a lot of credit. So, as we have already explained many times, the term Alamanni, that we will define together like this, other terms are Alemanni or Alemannians, whatever. I use Alamanni, prefer. Stems etymologically from this generic, let's say, international war cry that the name of Germanic confederacies embodied, represented all the men. So, actually, a group of tribes, of smaller Germanic groups, actually, that confederated already by the 3rd century, seemingly with the offensive purpose of occupying the Roman agri decumates that were this, as you know, it was basically this properly German land that it was essentially the few that could support the wine production. Still today, in fact, it's southwestern Germany is the warmest of German areas. There are vineyards, etc., and it had been also substantially Romanized, and the Romans basically bailed out of this region around 250 AD under the pressure properly of the Alamanni. That, as we will see now, we won't talk specifically about them as a people, because here it's a long time perspective, so it changes over time. I'd say the Alamanni are characterized a bit by they're more from the anti-Roman side of the Germanic peoples, right? Not that they had an intrinsic either pro or against Roman policy, but in their case they were basically the ones that kind of basically refused Christianization for a longer time, sided usually against the Roman federati, such as the Franks, renowned. They were actually doing, the same thing. Actually, archaeology shows us things like, Alemannic women fashion soon Romanized, for example, locally. But also the area was significantly culturally Germanized, and I would say it's normal. I mean, if you consider the late antiquity, the early Middle Ages, this was an area that didn't receive further, Latin input, if not, from an elite point of view. The clergy naturally, and especially then, was resettled by this significant part of Germanic peoples. The largest group of which seem to have been the Suebi, right, or Swabians. So those who had held up to essentially the second half of the 2nd century, which is the greatest Germanic confederacy, and basically the most important, at least the most ancient importance, let's say, since Caesar's times were already there, even before, and that however, kind of disintegrated. As you know, part of them migrated well into the northwestern Iberian Peninsula to form a kingdom on their own. The Alemanni would maintain this connection properly with the idea that they were partly Swabians, so much that, famously enough, in fact, the historical region of Alamannia would turn to be called Swabia, right? Because the memory was never lost. And more of that, the Swabians were Elbe people. The Alemanni were akin to the Bavarians, to the Longobards, right? They had similar languages in that sense. Jordanes in his Getica remembers the connection between the Alemanni and the Suebi. And it's from the 10th century that properly the name of Swabia gradually ousted that of Alamannia, right? Just as, I don't know, the Angle prevailed over the Saxon, speaking of, Germanic Britain. And in the same Swabia, the two adjectives, Swabian or Alemannic, actually remained up to the 13th century when Swabia prevailed. But it's interesting that this happened when in Western European history, the Germans altogether were already called with the synecdoche of actually Alamanni, still in French today, les Allemands, right? But, mainly France, Lombardy, that were bordering Alamannia and were kind of the most literary echoing areas in Europe. By synecdoche, began to speak of Germany as Alamannia altogether. Because it was the closest to. I mean, I presume that's the most natural. Since the 12th century, the Germans in this areas were known as Alaman altogether. So, the Alemanni were not really globetrotters. Like, aside from the various comitatus that could go around, etc. They fundamentally moved from the Elbe basin to the Agri decumates in this important area that fundamentally was east over the Rhine, southwards up to the confluence with the Main River. So importantly developed areas where also an important material culture, also famously enough metallurgic production, was shifting from Noricum to, in fact, the upper Rhine. We are not really well informed about what the process of integration with the Romans really happened like, whether, for example, there was a continuity with Alemannic settlements and Roman castra and ville, right? Sure is the Alemanni also founded important fortified settlements on high grounds on their own, probably in fear of Roman raids. The Romans actually fought pretty intensely with the Alemanni that at some point threatened also the invasion of Gaul. Think about the Battle of Strasbourg. We made a pretty hefty video on that when Julian defeated them in 357. But as we've seen, the Alemanni would also raid into Italy. I mean, they had an important, they were actually some of the most, if not the most effective Germanic enemies on the Western in the Western Roman Empire, right? The Alemanni had some of the finest armies out there, so very strong infantries with a great capacity in charging. They had the Bebre, that was like the Angles, basically the same degree of penetrability of the Roman pilum. Battles like Strasbourg naturally showed that the Romans had the full capacity of coping with them. But if you had to mention a typical enemy in the 4th century in Europe, like we would say, I don't know, the Alemanni, on the east, the Persians, and they were together with actually the Goths, that are also the other major group who was warring the Romans on the Danube. Essentially the first of the Germanic peoples to occupy, and this stably, differently from the Goths, a portion of the Roman Empire proper, Roman territory. The Goths in Dacia, but eventually that was abandoned. So this was also one of this continuity, let's say, was one of the reasons why the area was culturally Germanized. And because these areas weren't German initially, at least. So, well, yes, I mean, before the Romans conquered them, the Germans had pushed as so far as that, but it were also kind of borderline between, the Celtic world, etc. And also, the Alamanni remained for centuries relatively superficially Christianized, which is very interesting for us because it's one of the few Germanic peoples that still buried with warriors with the actual equipment up to the 8th century, right? So for a good century more than other Western European countries, because of their pagan custom that was continuing. So in the 5th century, the Alamanni sought to extend their area of settlement. Essentially on the wake of the great avalanche of peoples that at the beginning of the century had crossed the Rhine and sworn into Gaul, Spain, etc. And also because the Rhineland at that point had become thus a very fluid frontier with the Franks that were namely Roman allies but were basically cut off from the empire in that sense and were beginning also to expand on their own. So the Franks and the Alamanni came in conflicting against each other. But the stereotype is, yes, the Frank is eventually the most Roman or Catholic oriented, and the Alamanni the most kind of Germanic and pagan oriented. But they were actually pretty similar, right? They just made internationally certain field choices that were useful for them. And the Rhineland was definitely the most prized prey at that time for these peoples. So the conflict with the Franks brought to the defeat of the Alamanni by hands of King Clovis himself, that defeated them close to Cologne during their invasion of the lower Rhineland, so pretty close to the Frankish territory proper in 496-497, and eventually with the Battle of Tolbiac and the invasion of Alamannia in 506, that brought properly the region under Frankish domination, if not rule. We're not very informed about how the thing happened. The idea is that the Merovingians managed to crush the Alamanni and to send some Frankish elite and comital order fundamentally in the region. But it was, as we'll see now, a relatively decentralized area that surely saw important changes here, so that we can't even from this time onwards properly speak of Alamanni as the original people, but kind of a Frankish Alamannic elite ruling in this area where at this point the main powers in Europe were the Frankish bloc that was allied with the Byzantines, and then the Gothic bloc with Theodoric in Italy, and also the Upper Danube, the Illyricum, and the Visigothic Spain. Reason for which, when the Alamanni were crushed by the Franks, they were in part settled under Ostrogothic, protection in the Alpine foothills and valleys that would lead to Italy as essentially a buffer state that could protect Ostrogothic Italy from Frankish interference. Then eventually, when Ostrogothic power collapses, the Franks basically take over this whole area. They will launch also, together with the Alamanni part, some raids into Italy itself at the end of the Gothic War against the Romans. But let's say at this point, the Alamanni are fundamentally a client state of the Merovingians. And at this point, the Alemannic settlement extended essentially east towards the Lech River, south into Alpine Raetia, that we will talk about in a while, and west into Alsace, that today is France, but historically a German region, as you know, because with an Alemannic ethnic background proper. So the Merovingian conquerors of Alamannia set up dukes with the intention of sustaining Frankish political influence. We know that the Franks had to say which duke could rule, couldn't rule. They deposed some, and this went on as long as Merovingian royal authority was strong. But that lasted a few. The Franks basically fragmented into 4 distinct kingdoms and didn't quite have much of a kind of territorial unity anymore. So all these chunks of subject peoples that the Franks had framed under, at that point, concretely their empire, right? Because they were probably ruling over other peoples, including the Alamanni, the Burgundians, the Aquitanians, etc. Took the chance to augment their autonomy, to organize their policy on a more local base. But still, naturally, with important connections at this point were mostly of elites. The Frankish system was ultra-elite. It was an exception in by Germanic standards. It was a properly dynastic power that naturally all these subjected peoples' elites tended to imitate, to oust the freemen and to rise as important local dynasts. So that's a bit the deal of Alamannia. That here figures, in fact, these things are important. Like, it's not much a matter of having a light or heavy foreign domination, but it's really important to stress that when you're crushed in battle and you're able, you're obliged to kind of accept foreign rule, and some parts of your people relocate under the protection of other powers, you realize that here there is a unity that has disgregated, right? This is usually a great moment of privatization of power. That is to say, where the elites take matters in their own hands, augment their power. There's not much of a control anymore, and therefore Alamannia received a quite important influence in Frankish private culture in that regard from their previous, then more kind of egalitarian background. But still, elites had ruled, actually, because, for example, the 6th century Byzantine author Agatius observes that, albeit the Alamanni lived under Frankish suzerainty, they preserved their own customs and law. This was properly a matter of international recognition, in a way. And it was also merit of the same Franks, that surely were one of the single most warlike people in the history of early Middle Ages. That's basically all they did. They didn't know much of another activity in their mindset. But they, as we will see, managed to still frame these subject populations, yes, a bit with a sword, and not just a bit, but also giving them, some space from which they could cultivate these relations with the rulers and, share part of it. Because naturally, power was decentralized, and the problems that Merovingian dynasty was facing couldn't make it, reconstruct things in much of a different way. But still, it was a huge opportunity for the elites to be connected at such a high level, for such a huge power like the Merovingian one, and reinforce that, political and social order on their own people. There is an evidence from Clotaire II's confirmation of the Pactus Legis Alamannorum. So we are in the end of the 6th, beginning of the 7th century. This is a law code of the Alamanni, and they are that is just preserved in fragments, and they display through it a society that, as we were saying before, remained strikingly pagan until the early 7th century, without much influence. Then, eventually, King Dagobert I of the Franks, ruling between 623/9 or to 38/9, that was basically the only Frankish Merovingian ruler that, the last, we would say, that managed to collect a bit all these chunks of Frankish dominions, and for at least for during his reign, and to set some administrative reforms again, reactivated episcopal authority in the See of Constance. That would remain the most important one throughout Swabian history, partly in this period to facilitate the Christian missionary work proper. as we explained countless times, if you establish a church locally, you have properly a centralized structure, a territorialized administration. You have literacy. You have properly a way to control also the communities, etc. So the Franks cared a lot for Christianizing these areas. They did an important job, but also some other areas of Germany, such as Franconia, for example. It literally takes name after the Franks. Well, that's where basically the Franks succeeded, where the Romans didn't. Being essentially colonizing very slowly and with great effort this fundamentally central and southern parts of Germany. The last would be in the north, Saxony, that would be brought down in the way we well know by Charlemagne. It was actually an astonishing success, but the Merovingians had already began this penetration, infiltration, and Christianization, colonization of Germany. So this happened through the Irish mission, chiefly in Burgundy. It was more Romanized, but also importantly connected to Alamannia, so much that it extended in the region. There is this dramatic figure, that is Gallus, was Columbanus' pupil, that founded St. Gallen, right? One of the most prominent German monasteries, would have at least become. Another important one was the one of Reichenau, founded from 724 by Pirmin. And some see in this a bit of a like as if one had been promoted in its foundation by the Franks, the other by the local Alemannic nobility, but it's not really clear whose patronage really was. I mean, to cut neatly between the interests of these elites, so that, as if it had been a national matter, it's actually not really correct. Everybody had definitely to profit from an expansion of the church in this land. Surely it was important enough to see who would control these assets, but still it was important that, territorially speaking, it was there. Also, importantly enough, in spite of their defeat in 506, at the hand of the Franks, the Alemanni maintained essentially an ethnic identity, right? They remained namely a distinct people. They surely underwent important cultural changes, but local politics was able to maintain this cohesion, which would play in part in their favor, and definitely, and especially, I would say, of the Franks, that would never at that point, let Alamannia go, specifically by, as we've seen, appointing the aristocracies. They would ensure part of an important channel of connection with the rest of the people. The same goes for the church, and also leaving to these people their own law, right? Which was kind of a fair compromise, all in all. As we were saying before, in the second half of the 7th century, the Merovingian royal authority collapsed. So we witness the rise of a stronger and especially hereditary dukedom in Alamannia. Even the name of duke is important because it's kind of more, I wouldn't say necessarily more ethnic, but it was conceived a bit as such. The Franks went by counts, by decomites, right? The duches here were properly referring to not just a local but a militarized power. So Alamannia remained kind of a frontier area that had to be ruled by military leaders, specifically, whether they were appointed by the Franks or emerging locally, right? The thing was always negotiated in a way or another. And the Alemanni also interfered at that point in the pretty messed up late Merovingian period by backing the Austrasian mayors of Pallas. That would become the same Carolingian dynasty. And it was a move that, in hindsight, would backfire. But, at the time, they had their interest because basically the Alemanni were trying to counter the richer and closer Neustria, let's say, while by essentially backing the Austrasian dynasty, etc. So things would remain. They weren't that far away because it was still along the Rhine Valley. The Carolingian power developed around Cologne, etc. Initially, but still, it was aimed at countering what seemed to be the greatest problem for them. The thing would backfire, however, in perspective, because when the Carolingians reached an important power, and also actually pretty early on, they turned their attention against the Alamanni. Pepin II in 709 sent military expeditions into the region, which revealed how permeable it was, right? Initially not against properly the Alemannic Duke Landfrid, but the latter eventually having to fight to maintain the independence of Alamannia until his death in 730. We don't know whether in combat or in other circumstances, but this definitely shows that Alamannia altogether had not particularly maintained a great, dramatic solidity altogether. That it had a kind of a unitary profile when the whole land was seen, politically speaking, namely, but still the Franks had the upper hand. The Alamannia would not be able to develop an alternative power to the one of the Franks. And in fact, the beginning of the 8th century is the last moment of Alemannic autonomy. When Charles Martel, mayor of Palace of Austrasia, died in 741, he had assigned Alamannia to his elder son Carloman, who dealt with the Alemannic nobility in the most ferocious way. He basically brought the region under control by 744, and he literally exterminated the Alemannic aristocracy at the Council of Cannstatt in 746. These noblemen were invited and eventually, massacred, and that basically beheaded the local nobility that I stress here were basically Frankish Alemannic, right? The same Frankish count had been sent there historically by the Merovingians, had married into the local nobility and began to autonomize themselves. I mean, this is a bit, the history of the Frankish history in a nutshell, right? And this was a moment of important reassertion instead of Frankish royal prerogatives, right? Not just in this outer, in this properly foreign lens, yet under Frankish control, but also in this within the same Francia, right? Both in Austria, especially when also in southern Gaul, where especially a lot of clergymen, bishops that were fundamentally warlords, just like the lay aristocracy, had over the centuries of Merovingian crisis usurped many lands of the royal domain, and now the Carolingians were claiming back essentially to pay their professional retinues as they were developing them, and the Alemanni basically ended up like this. So the mid 8th century sees a proper and definite subjugation of Alamannia to Frankish power. So what happened at Cannstatt is also not very clear. Whether the nobility was actually tricked into it and massacred, or whether there was an actual trial, right? So that this episode was actually mediated from a political institutional point of view. Sure, though, is that the Franks secured their control over the region after that. The ducal fisc and much of the property of the Alemannic nobility passed into the hands of the Carolingians proper. Frankish counts were appointed once again, and also new monasteries were founded with Frankish money. So we have this interesting document that is the Lex Alamannorum, right? Which is very similar. Alamannia and Bavaria have similar juridical histories. Let's say this is a law code that shows fundamentally what Alemannic society was at the time. And it's interesting that this is not to be given for granted, passing through the migration era, etc., that Alamannia was seen politically and juridically as a single entity, right? So the nobility, whatever this had happened, had managed to maintain this land from a political administrative point of view, and as such, the local customs were codified. Also, speaking of the aforementioned fragmentary pactus, says that the law had been issued by the assembly, summoned literally from all the parts of the Frankish realm by the time of Clotaire II, together with many bishops, counts, and dukes. This is very important because it shows fundamentally a cooperation between the Alemanni and the Merovingians, similarly to what had happened with other peoples under Frankish control. But the Lex Alamannorum instead refers, actually dating back to the time of the Duke Landfrid, that, as we've seen, fought against Frankish interference and ruling between 710 and 730, that the law had been issued by a call of noblemen called maiores, so the most powerful of the land, that the law, specifically Lex Alamannorum, had been restored under the guidance of the Duke. So this gives rise to an interesting speculation that is perhaps plausible from an historical point of view. That is to say that whereas the Pactus is showing fundamentally law-making mediated by the Franks with an important interference from the outside, the Lex Alamannorum actually reflects the properly not just the autonomy in law-making of the Alemanni, but at that point a political statement that would essentially favor the ideology and international policy of a country wanted essentially to more autonomy, right? And that had somewhat issued laws now according to their own the restored system, the restored way. And we know, however, how the story went. With 746, this autonomy was basically eradicated. So, rather like the Lex Juvariorum that we will see on another occasion, the Alemannic law is concerned with a privileged position for the church. It also attributes dramatic power to the Duke, and that concerns both peacekeeping, administration of justice, and the conduct of war. This is interesting because it speaks of an elite administration, essentially, because both the Pactus and the Lex show essentially the division and subdivision of nobles, freemen, and servile groups. That is much more complicated, say, than the Saxon or Bavarian codes, stressing that the nobility had consistently taken over. This explains, in a way, also, both the autonomy ambitions, because they had some consistent power at home, but also the kind of, at the end of the day, the easier integrability of Alamannia under Frankish control by certain, both by force but also by the maintenance of such pre-existing order. And however, we see also an important influence of Frankish custom and of the rules of the church in the Lex Alamannorum that is mirrored in part by the Lex Juvariorum. Surely they influenced each other. It's possible that Alamannia also received influence from Bavaria in this regard. You know that Bavaria was essentially, it's not that properly there was such a thing like the Bavar people, like the Alemanni were. The Bavars were created essentially as a Merovingian duchy. It was a political creation in this area frontier, and it was essentially collecting peoples from very different, also ethnic backgrounds, were Germans, Celts, Romans, other elements, even Slavs, etc. They were, however, landing in the right bank of the upper Danube Valley that were a bit trying to essentially coming out of Frankish control in a sense. Bavaria more, but also it was weaker. Alamannia was closer to Francia naturally, but it was kind of more warlike in appearance, especially in the early period. And the assimilation of Alamannia to the Frankish Empire was, however, a long and violent process, right? It surely was more similar, as we were saying here, it was initially a more warlike entity, and therefore it resembles more the subjugation of Saxony rather than the one of Bavaria. But the Frankish ruling elite definitely displayed some intelligence here, because as we were saying, the Franks were just about the sport. They literally didn't think or see or conceive anything else. They had a fully essentially privatized political culture. They reasoned just by war making, and that's why they were the best essentially among the Romano Germans in Western Europe about this, because that's the only thing they did, and they did it better than all the others. And the way they created the empire definitely proves it. But they also displayed, as we were saying before, an important sensitivity for the local pre-existing institutions, right? They realized that they couldn't just hammer these people to death. They wanted, especially Alamannia, to be a cohesive entity, because it would have been easier for them to control it, right? So it's a history that goes at waves of either war or integration, but that definitely included successfully this country into the Frankish dominions to stay. And this largely happened through the organization of counties, so specific Frankish leaders were sent to control certain districts in the land, and as we've seen, they also autonomized themselves. There was, generally speaking, in Alamannia a normal connection with Frankish authority. It was seen also as a justice deliverer in case of because of internal quarrels of an authority that they could reference to in order to also get legitimized as terms, especially of ducal power, who had to rule in the land. There is also a great success of the church, right? Alamannia successfully builds a religious and literate culture through Christianization, the foundation or restoration or a refoundation of bishoprics and monasteries, some of which would become the most important in Germany and also in medieval Europe. So this goes, in spite of all the blood spilled by the Franks, etc., as a good work of civilization as well, right? And sometimes you just have to do it because there is not much of another way of coping with these people. The Alemanni were quite warlike, as we've seen themselves. So Alamannia actually sees both the retention of its identity and the flourishing of a Christian culture. Right, is a success of Francization, of Christianization. So during the time of Louis the Pious' reign between 1814 and 1840, and its aftermath down to the split of the empire with the Treaty of Verdun in 843, Alamannia fell into the Eastern Frankish kingdom under the rule of Louis the German. And as you know, also the following period is pretty troubled, right? There was this, phase of Eastern, Frankish autonomy then, namely under Charles the Third, there was this last reunification. But as for most of the Germanic lands, but an important change in political history would occur for Alamannia, essentially between the late 9th and the early 10th century, with the emergence of a new ducal regime, right, out of power struggles between the church and the aristocracy. Let's say that Alamannia was in a peculiar situation because Saxony and Bavaria were frontier areas. They had to defend/expand against the Slavs. So the let's say the political and military cohesions of these lands took greater form. So it's also fascinating because these were some of the least Frankicized areas historically. I mean, Saxony, had fought bitterly against Francization, but turned out to be its astonishing success in the form of what would happen in the 10th century to recollect the imperial legacy, etc. Under military and properly imperial rule. Bavaria also was from very far. Yes, it had, as we've seen, received important Frankish influence, but still was a bit of an area on its own, on the outer eastern, let's say, frontier. Alamannia was more internal, right? Surely, at this point, the area was threatened by the Magyars, as we will see. Properly, this is the moment of the second invasions. Even the Saracens would at some point launch a raid into the Rhineland via land. The seas were infested in the north with the Danes. Germany was hammered pretty hard by the Magyars, and in general, we assist in here properly to a let's say to a shift in properly of territorial control from the hierarchy down to the local powers. Right, this was the great consequence of the disintegration of Carolingian royal authority that in East Francia had especially accelerated in the 80s of the 9th century, and even more with that of the Emperor Arnulf of Carinthia in 899. So this so-called ethnic duchies, of which Alamannia was one, the Eastern Frankish kingdom, were for some point, especially before the rise of Henry the Fowler, left a bit on their own. And yet, the imperial authority didn't completely evaporate. Like, this is one of the most important aspects also of post-Carolingian history. There was still an idea that there would be an emperor, there would be a king in all these lands. And let's say the most important political figure here working for the various, for royal authority, imperial authority at the time was principally Bishop Solomon III of Constance, who was such between 890 919, witnessing he was essentially a military bishop, right? He was a pretty warlike clergyman who was able to keep things together on behalf of royal authority, but amidst, as we'll see, many struggles that reflect, generally speaking, the fragmentation of political power within the same Alamannia. Solomon was abbot of St. Gallen itself, so he disposed of this dramatic wealth, resources, as a local authority in the region. It's difficult to tell whether the fragmentation of power in Alamannia through the bitter struggles that followed with the eclipse of Carolingian authority it was due mainly to the demise of the latter, or to progressed tensions and rivalries existing between essentially the elites. Right, we can't even draw, the churchmen of the nobility. It was more among the aristocrats themselves altogether. But surely there was a connection with a much older past as well, and with this, local effort to build, let's say, a more stable government from the base, however, now of private assets that would not be protected by a major authority, but that were now that their holders had to make order on their own. As we've seen, the most developed area of Alamannia was the one around the Lake of Constance, where also the Alemannic dukes had drawn most of their resources. This asset had specifically been seized, as we've seen, by the Carolingians in the 40s of the 8th century. So it had been properly also reorganized for, and strengthened for facilitating the controlled region. Now, the local aristocracy began to battle bitterly over it. Also, there is this other historical region that is Raetia Prima in Roman times that would fundamentally be included into the Alemannic dominion, and that, however, at the time of the Merovingian king Theudebert, between the 30s and the 40s of the 6th century, had been expressly stripped from Alamannia to constitute an administrative center on its own, based on the Upper Rhine city of Chur. And why is that? Because it was a strategical asset for the Franks to cross into Italy through Burgundy, right? And this would fundamentally give them an edge over the Longobards that at that point were at war with them. And this would be important also for the political geography of Europe, because fundamentally if you look at the borders between Italy and its northwestern neighbors, the watershed is much more shifted towards to the Transalpine area, because that's where the Franks historically in the early Middle Ages had the upper hand, right? Whereas at this time the Longobards had crossed as well into the Danubian side, to the Danubian valley from the Bavarian side, because the Bavarians instead were the weaker from that side. And Chur and its bishopric eventually and its county came to overlap. What is fascinating is that, albeit the Alemanni settled in the province, in the surroundings, the Franks still retained very strong control of the area, because they garrisoned it with the point of holding it at all cost for the advantage it could derive. Then, of course, over time, with this disintegration of Merovingian royal authority, this thing came to, it blurred itself. But it's important to stress the strategic relevance that this center maintained, so much that we talk specifically of Alamannia and Alpine Raetia as two distinct areas. But of course, they were actually, basically the same thing, also from an ethnic point of view. This entity was called Ducatus Curiensis, so the Duchy of Chur, and it maintained this separate status from lowland Alamannia, which is proven also by a law code that includes essentially Roman, Frankish, and Visigothic influences, known as the Lex Romana Curiensis. So this is interesting because it belongs more to the southern Gallic influence rather than, so you see, the Lex Romana Visigothorum, the Lex Romana Burgundianum, etc. We're also seen in the history of medieval law videos. Well, this area was more, more influenced by these traditions than by properly the Frankish one. Was more Romanized in a sense. And what is fascinating is that the Lex Romana Curiensis was not a fiction, was actually in use, right, as an effective law. It appears to be so well into the 10th century, so to the moment of greatest disgregation of any power, capacity of enforcing laws, etc. So this had properly become part of the Duchy of Chur and of its inhabitants. So we were saying before, also the bishopric of Chur was particularly important. It the bishop had properly an authority in Alpine Raetia. Albeit comital administration had been reinforced under Carolingian times. So in this respect, also Alpine Raetia underwent the same fate of Alamannia and Bavaria in the second, from the second half of the 8th century to the end of the same, the consolidation of a Frankish comital authority, right? Albeit we're not dramatically documented on how such assimilation happened, right? There are not particularly documented areas. We note, however, that one of the counts of the early 9th century Alpine Raetia, called Hunfrid, founded a dynasty that was to provide counts, margraves, and dukes that are also called a bit, all in different ways, either because they, the sources are imprecise, and or because they kind of actually, changed. Either they summed up different titles in a, as we've seen, pretty fluid political situation that would build an important political domination over Alpine Raetia up to the time of Bishop Solomon III. And as it happened for other German regions, the Magyar invasions brought to the rise, the importance of the local dynasties for the sake of defense organization. Alamannia was invaded by the Magyars in 910. And in parallel, Margrave Burkhard I of Raetia, that was the leading descendant of Hunfrid, had himself proclaimed Duke of Alamannia. This is a bit like, a different scale, a different dynamic, but how the Ottonians rose to power, right? The Eastern Frankish kingdom is threatened by the Hungars, so there is a momentary political cohesion in an otherwise very competitive and aggressive, violent, intertwined struggle reality that says, okay, we need a military commander here to cope with the threat, with a unique authority. Henry the Fowler is chosen, and that leads to the further expansion of the Ottonian dynasty, also for defense need. So Burkhard I was confronted by Bishop Solomon III, being supported in this by another, as we've seen, by another man of Eastern Frankish royal authority, that was the Count Palatine Erkangar. So Burkhard was essentially rising as the local ethnic dynast, if you want, and his power was being checked by the Bishop of Constance together with the Count Palatine. So this was naturally happening because Burkhard was, in a sense, usurping public authority in the area, building a private dominion. So much that he would be captured in 911 and put to death. They didn't really go, they weren't really tender about these things. So this was, however, in turn, the occasion for the bishop and the Count Palatine to essentially augment their own power locally. So especially Solomon III of Constance was a bit the one for which this would be less expected, and in order to legitimize his coup, he invited the new Eastern Frankish king, Conrad I, ruling between 911 and 918, to his same abbey of St. Gallen, and also arranged for him a marriage with the Count Palatine's sister, that in turn was also widow of Margrave Luitpold of Bavaria, who had been killed in 907 at Pressburg, Bratislava, against the Magyars. So trying to confer through his medium to the Eastern Frankish king an important power joining this southern Germanic areas such as Alamannia and Bavaria under his influence. However, for reasons that we're not really informed about, the local balance didn't last, because fundamentally Solomon III was opposed both by the Count Palatine Erkanger and the same Conrad I at some point, right? So much that the bishop was imprisoned by the Count Palatine. Eventually there would be another twist, as Conrad I instead, decided to free the bishop and to sentence the same Erkanger to death, right? In 1917. So this example illustrates pretty much from an Alemannic perspective, the broader crisis being experienced in the Eastern Frankish kingdom in the early 10th century, before the rise of the Ottonians, and after the end of any practical Carolingian rule after 899. And as we've seen here, we have important churchmen trying to take control of local power, but essentially failing in front of the violent ambition of secular magnates that were trying to expand as much their control as they could, being unmatched by any significant royal power, at least when this was possible. And it was Burkhard I's son, Burkhard II, that in this would take his revenge. He had fled after his father's assassination, first to Italy, then he had come back. So this is how the Unfrid dynasty temporarily rose back again to the ducal power of Swabia from 917. When Henry the Fowler, Duke of Saxony, was elected as Eastern Frankish king in 919 by the Franconians and the Saxons, the southern Germans weren't particularly happy with that. Swabia and Bavaria did not accept his title. But Henry managed, proved to be strong enough by invading Swabia himself. At that point, Burkhard II prudently accepted submission, and the Duke kept, however, pursuing an autonomous foreign policy, which was his doom, as he basically intervened in the quarrels that were occurring between the Burgundian kingdom and the Italic kingdom, so much that he was killed in Lombardy in 926 during a campaign, and with a broader failure also of the whole enterprise. The Burgundians were actually interfering with Swabia at this time, so much that, if I'm not wrong, the same Burkhard had managed to fence off an attack from King Rudolf of Burgundy that had invaded the St. Constance area. It was definitely the most profitable. In fact, that was the direction that any ruler of those areas would take, right? It would happen later with the Habsburgs would come to defend it in the 13th century. Savoy would try to expand there later on. So that was definitely an important asset. After Burkhard II's death, the Swabians accepted the rule of Hermann I. That was basically a cousin of King Conrad I. He was essentially a Burgundian Franconian who had married Burkhard II's widow. This was a very clever move by certain, for both sides in a sense, because by connecting with the Franconian milieu, was also connected with Burgundy, and consequently with Saxony, as Henry the Fowler had proposed the same Hermann. Swabia was entering, let's say, in this western side of the Eastern Frankish kingdom that was a bit the axis on which Ottonian power was formed. You know that effective Ottonian power in Eastern Frankish kingdom entailed included Saxony and Franconia. Right, Saxony is the most militarized area, the more warlike. Franconia as pretty rich one, and also the one that bore to its name the grandeur of Carolingian imperial legacy. Alamannia and Lotharingia, excuse me, I said Burgundy before. No, yes, I said Lotharingia. Were instead these a bit more troubled areas. Lotharingia had basically returned to the Eastern Frankish allegiance in 925 because it kind of floated between the Eastern and Frankish kingdom. So the Ottonians had managed to take it back into the eastern part. Also, Alamannia, as we've seen, the Suabia at this point decided to essentially to stick to that power. So it was a great opportunity for the ruling dynasties, and in general it was also a bit the consequence of the failed Swabian attempts to autonomy in the face of the Ottonian rise. And this passage is actually very important because Swabia at that point wouldn't be able to resist Ottonian power for a long time anymore. In fact, especially the Hunfrid family wouldn't manage to essentially usurp royal rights and were obliged to remain under Henry I's authority in this context. And in fact, Henry the Fowler was actually more successful in Swabia and Lotharingia than in Bavaria, that would give properly a rise to a dynastic split of the same Ottonians at some point, would eventually conflicting about Otto III with Henry II, his uncle, and that would give a bit that profile that we see later with the Franconian and the Swabian imperial dynasties, with properly a Western German center of power that eventually would even exclude Saxony, would join Bavaria with Welfen, right, and actually centering to Swabia with the Hohenstaufen. But that's another. We are far from that. But it's important that, let's say, Swabia was hinged to this Western axis at this point, because that also played its, that included it in more directly into the game of power, especially also considered its strategic significance, the proximity to Italy, and therefore the connection with the imperial crown, etc. That there was an area that would facilitate also the imperial mission, in a sense. That's in a way why also this, the imperial dynasties would shift ever more towards the south of Germany until the 12th century. And also Henry I at this point showed that Swabia could even be controlled from distance, right? That is to say, it proved that the local nobility didn't have much of a chance proper to expect from a general rise. It was mostly during Otto I's reign who began, from the top of his power, the final defeat of the Hungars at the Battle of Lech in 955, but in general, his rise to power initially on the consolidated basis, especially that his father had left, and especially this imposing military clienteles and fortified centers in Saxony, that the duchies would be used as a sort of appanage, right? So much that he installed, and that's how the split with Welfen began, his brother Henry in Bavaria, his son-in-law Conrad the Red in Lotharingia, and his son Ludolf in Swabia. And paradoxically, it's exactly under the Ottonian dynasty. The Swabia would create the greatest problem for the Ottonians, in a sense, because Ludolf was essentially married by his father to Hermann I of Swabia's daughter Ida in 947. He succeeded as a Duke of Swabia properly in 949, but at some point he basically went astray, let's say, from his father's policy, and he properly took another path. Now we don't digress much on his figure. We can talk about another time, but he's essentially troubled the Otto I policy both in Germany and in Italy, and came into open contrast with his father, right? So much that he was deposed from the Swabian dukedom in 954. The range of his actions were also not just Swabia. As we've seen, he properly intervened directly into Italy, following a bit the same interests that had been of Burkhard II, right? A bit more of, actually was a failure in that case too. But he also interfered in Thuringia, etc. So it's a bit of a more, a broader scale, let's say, policy that reflects at the same point the augmented power of the Ottonian dynasty all over the Eastern Frankish kingdom altogether. But he was deposed, as we've seen, in 954, and albeit he tried to reacquire his status by force, he died in 957. And at this point, Otto, you can imagine, what Otto I would kind of felt in this broader situation. I mean, to conflict openly with the son, and to seeing dead at the same time, he somewhat, he understood what the point was, right? That his son had managed to ride the autonomy instances and discontent of Swabia, and therefore he settled for a sort of reconciliation by appointing the representative of the Humfrid dynasty at the time, Burkhard III, who ruled as a duke between 954 and 973 to replace Ludolf. And this is interesting because eventually Swabia would remain, an important, still, would remain eventually within the Ottonian institutional system in a sense. It was a pretty troubled time altogether. Eventually, with the crisis opened by the death of Otto II, things went downhill again. But let's say there was a step forward towards the integration of Swabia into the broader political institutional system of the Eastern Frankish kingdom. Eventually, Burkhard III pursued again the usual thing. He also invaded Italy once again and died, albeit with some greater military success in Lombardy, in the same place Burkhard the second had. I mean, there were here much broader, actually international interests that involved not just Germany, Burgundy, Italy, but also the Mediterranean. So now we can't properly digress on it. But it's important that fundamentally from 926, Swabia was accepting the exposition of royal authority by the Saxon dynasty, such as Lotharingia had done from 925 and Bavaria from 936. But the one we develop later would be yet another world. And for now, we stop here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.